The weight of expectations. The morning sunlight cast long, gentle shadows across Peter's room, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. He stood there for a moment, allowing the quiet to envelop him, but the peace he had hoped for was elusive. His thoughts whirled like a storm inside his mind, each thought more turbulent than the last. His hands, now steady, worked to tie the knot in his tie. It was the same dark tie he had worn for years, a symbol of his modest life and quiet dignity. He had no interest in the extravagance that surrounded his fiancée's family. To him, it had never mattered what others thought of him. But today, the situation felt different. Today, the pressure was palpable. This was not just about him, it was about Emily and the life they had chosen together. He paused, his eyes flicking over the worn picture frames on the shelf. A picture of his mother, smiling brightly in her youth, hung beside a photograph of him as a child, sitting on Thomas's lap. It was hard to look at sometimes, but it was a reminder of the love that had shaped him, a love that had never been defined by wealth or social standing. Thomas had been both mother and father to him after her death, and in his steady, quiet way, had shown him what it meant to rise above adversity. Peter's mind wandered back to that fateful day years ago when Emily had first introduced him to her parents. He had been nervous then, but nothing could have prepared him for the cool reception he received from her mother, Margaret. Margaret had smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that Peter knew well, the kind that masked skepticism. He could see the judgment in the way she studied him, as though trying to figure out what Emily saw in a man like him. George, too, had been polite, but distant. He had asked questions that hinted at his concern, questions about Peter's family, his background, his plans for the future. At the time, Peter had done his best to answer with confidence, but there had always been an undercurrent of doubt in their words. Emily, being Emily, had insisted that her parents would come around, that they would understand how much Peter meant to her. But deep down, Peter had known the truth. He wasn't sure if they ever would. The past few months had been a whirlwind, with wedding plans taking over every waking moment. Emily had been so excited, so hopeful that her parents would finally accept Peter, that they would see what she saw in him, a kind, hard-working man who loved her with everything he had. But as the wedding day loomed closer, Peter had started to fear that this would be the day when everything came crashing down. He glanced at his phone, checking the time again. It was almost time to leave for the venue. Emily had already left with her parents, heading to the grand estate where the ceremony would take place. The air was thick with tension, and Peter could feel it wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. He wasn't just nervous about marrying Emily, he was nervous about her family and their reaction to the man who had raised him. He thought of Thomas once again, his father, who was the embodiment of quiet strength. Thomas had never been one to boast, never sought attention. He had worked tirelessly his entire life, scrubbing floors, cleaning buildings, doing the work that no one else wanted to do. Despite the constant prejudice he faced, Thomas had never once allowed it to diminish his sense of self-worth. To Peter, his father was a role model, someone whose wisdom transcended his occupation. But to Emily's parents? They had never seen Thomas through Peter's eyes. It was an unspoken understanding between them that Thomas would attend the wedding as Peter's father, but Peter feared that George and Margaret would see him as something less worthy of the role of father-in-law, less worthy of being a part of their lives. He could already imagine the questions they would ask, the judgments they would make in whispers. But he couldn't protect Thomas from their gaze. No matter how much he wanted to shield his father from their disapproval, today was about them, about Emily and Peter, and about their future. Peter turned away from the mirror and grabbed his coat. He had to go. Emily would need him, and despite the nervous knot in his stomach, he couldn't let his insecurities hold him back. He had fought too hard to get here, to be with her. He would not let anything, not even her parents' narrow views, stand in the way of their happiness. He stepped outside into the cool morning air, feeling the weight of his surroundings pressing down on him. The world beyond the walls of their small house seemed so vast, so unfamiliar, but it was the world he had to navigate for the woman he loved. The car ride to the estate was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine, and the closer they got to their destination, the more Peter's heart raced. As they pulled up to the gates of George and Margaret's estate, Peter's chest tightened. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming. The high stone walls, the manicured gardens, the perfectly kept lawns, it all spoke of a world so different from the one Peter had grown up in. It was as though he had been transported into a realm where he didn't belong, where every step he took would be scrutinized, judged. The gates swung open, and they drove past the rows of expensive cars, each one a symbol of the life that Emily's family led. Inside, the house was even more imposing. The high ceilings, the gleaming marble floors, the ornate chandeliers, it all seemed so cold, so distant. Peter couldn't help but feel like an outsider, a guest who had overstayed his welcome. As they entered the grand hall, he was met by the piercing gaze of Margaret, who was already there, her hands clasped in front of her like a queen waiting for her subject. George was standing beside her, his eyes cold and calculating, his mouth twisted into a faint, almost imperceptible frown. "Peter," Margaret said, her voice as smooth and controlled as always. "It's so lovely to see you again." But the words felt empty, hollow, as if she were speaking them only because it was expected of her. There was no warmth, no recognition of the person Peter truly was. Peter managed a tight smile. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice betraying none of the nervousness that churned inside him. "Your father is here too, I assume?" George asked, his tone neutral but with a hint of skepticism. Peter nodded. "Yes, he'll be here soon." Margaret's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough for Peter to catch. "I'm sure he'll fit right in," she said, though her words felt more like an observation than a greeting. Peter's heart sank. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that things would go smoothly. That for once, Emily's family might see him for who he truly was, not just the man who loved their daughter, but the man who had fought for every inch of his place in this world. But even before Thomas arrived, he could already feel the invisible walls rising around them, pushing him further away from acceptance. As the afternoon wore on, Peter's worst fears began to unfold. Emily tried her best to keep the conversation light, to smooth over the awkwardness between him and her parents, but it was clear that the gulf between their worlds was widening. The whispered comments, the subtle glances, the questions about his upbringing, it was all there, hidden behind the facade of politeness. Every word, every glance felt like an obstacle he had to overcome, but no matter how hard he tried to prove himself, it seemed that nothing would ever be enough. And then, as the clock ticked toward the moment when Thomas would arrive, Peter realized that this was more than just about him. This was about Emily, too. She had fought so hard to get to this point, to convince her parents that their love was worth something, that Peter was worth something. And now, it was all about to come crashing down. The doorbell rang, and Peter's breath caught in his throat. It was Thomas. The moment of truth had arrived. The clash of worlds. The doorbell echoed through the grand hall, a sharp sound that seemed to reverberate in Peter's chest. He could feel the tension shift in the room, the air thick with anticipation. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to unfold that would define the rest of the day. Peter turned to Emily, his heart pounding in his chest. She squeezed his hand reassuringly, though he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had hoped that this day would be different, that her parents would finally accept Peter and see the depth of his character, but now, standing at the threshold of her family's world, it felt like an uphill battle. No matter how much she loved Peter, no matter how strongly they believed in each other, her parents' attitudes about class, race, and wealth were far harder to overcome than she had anticipated. Thomas had always been a man of integrity, someone who didn't demand attention or validation. He had always taught Peter that true worth came from within, from the way you treated others, from the quiet dignity you carried yourself with, no matter your station in life. Peter had never been ashamed of his father's humble profession as a janitor, but he knew that George and Margaret would see it as a strike against Thomas's character, an unforgivable mark on his reputation. To them, Thomas wasn't a man to be admired, he was an obstacle to their daughter's future. When Thomas entered the room, Peter could feel the collective gaze of the guests shift towards him. He wasn't dressed in a tuxedo like the other men at the gathering. Instead, he wore a simple, yet neatly pressed suit, one that he had worn countless times before for important events in Peter's life. His shoes were polished, his tie straight, but there was no mistaking the fact that he didn't belong in this world. He was different, and to many of the guests in the room, that difference was something they couldn't overlook. Thomas's presence was steady, unshaken by the stares that followed him as he walked through the door. He nodded politely at Emily's parents, his demeanor calm and respectful, though his eyes, kind and wise, seemed to see through the superficiality of their greetings. He didn't need their approval, but Peter could tell that his father was doing his best to keep the peace, for his son, for Emily, for this fragile moment that could tip either way. "Thomas," George said, his voice a little too loud, a little too stiff. He extended his hand, the polite greeting carrying an undercurrent of scrutiny. "It's good to finally meet you." Thomas shook George's hand firmly, but his grip was not one of submission. It was the kind of handshake that conveyed strength, not subservience. "Likewise," Thomas replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience but with no hint of arrogance. "Thank you for having me." Peter watched this exchange closely, noting the subtle shift in George's posture, the way he tried to mask his discomfort with a strained smile. Margaret, standing slightly behind her husband, observed Thomas with a calculating gaze, as though she were trying to size him up, measure his worth based on criteria that had nothing to do with character or heart. Peter could see the disapproval brewing in her eyes, the judgment that had always lurked beneath the surface. "You've done well, Peter," George continued, attempting to steer the conversation in a more comfortable direction, though Peter could tell he was struggling. "It's nice to see that you've managed to find your way despite, well, the challenges." Peter clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to lash out. The implication was clear: despite his background, despite his father's job, despite everything that Peter had worked for, he still had to prove that he belonged here, that he was good enough for their daughter. It wasn't the first time George had made such comments, but hearing it today, in front of his father, felt like a slap to the face. Emily, sensing Peter's discomfort, stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke up. "Dad, can we please not do this today?" she said, her words cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "I've asked you both to be respectful, to give Peter and his father a chance. This day isn't about proving anything to anyone, it's about us, our love, our future together. Can we at least honor that?" For a moment, the room fell quiet, the only sound the distant hum of conversation from the guests who had gathered in other parts of the house. Peter's eyes met Emily's, and in that brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. Despite the uncertainty, despite the disapproving stares of her parents, Emily stood by him, unwavering in her support. He could feel the love and strength between them, and it was a lifeline he clung to, even as the walls around him seemed to grow higher. Margaret cleared her throat, her lips pursing as she considered Emily's words. George, too, shifted uncomfortably, but neither of them said anything more on the matter. Instead, they turned their attention to the gift table, where the first of the wedding presents had been placed. It seemed like a convenient distraction, a way to avoid the elephant in the room, the unspoken tension that lingered in the air like smoke. "Let's start with the gifts, shall we?" Margaret suggested, her tone a little too bright, though the discomfort was still evident. "We wouldn't want to keep everyone waiting." The guests, eager to shift away from the uncomfortable exchange, began to gather around the table. Peter felt the weight of their gazes, their subtle judgments, but he refused to let it show. He had come this far, and no matter what happened today, he wouldn't let their disapproval define him. He had worked too hard for this moment, had fought too long for a future with Emily. And he was not going to let anyone, least of all her parents, take that from him. As they all gathered around the table, the first gift was opened. It was from George and Margaret, wrapped in expensive paper with a glossy ribbon. Peter could tell from the weight of the box that it was something extravagant. Perhaps it was a car, or a check with an amount so large it could change their lives in an instant. But as Emily unwrapped the package and revealed the sleek, expensive-looking vase inside, Peter couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. It wasn't the gift that bothered him, it was the assumption behind it. It was as if they were saying that this was what mattered. This was what made them worthy of their approval. Money, status, and appearance. Then, the conversation shifted once again, with the focus turning to Thomas and the gift he had brought. Peter had no idea what it could be. He had seen his father work for so many years, yet he knew that there was little in terms of material wealth for Thomas to offer. But what Thomas lacked in material wealth, he more than made up for in wisdom and love. Peter could already feel the weight of his father's quiet presence, the strength and humility that would soon speak louder than anything anyone could say. Thomas stood quietly at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd before resting on Peter. There was no need for words, he knew what his son was going through, and he had been through the same kind of judgment himself many times before. But today, he wasn't going to let the opinions of others cloud the love he had for his son. With a steady hand, Thomas reached into the bag by his side and brought out a small, unassuming package. The contrast between his gift and the extravagance of the others couldn't have been more stark. The guests exchanged confused glances, some even frowning slightly as they watched Thomas approach the table. But Peter saw only the quiet dignity in his father's eyes. This wasn't a moment of showmanship, it was a moment of authenticity. Thomas had always believed in the value of hard work, humility, and love over anything that could be bought with money. And this gift would prove just that. As Thomas reached the table and handed the gift to Peter, the room fell silent once again. Every eye was on them, waiting to see what this humble man, this janitor, had to offer. Peter's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the package. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that whatever it was, it would be something that came from his father's heart. Something that couldn't be bought, but only earned through years of sacrifice and love. With a quiet nod of acknowledgement, Thomas stood back and watched, his expression calm but expectant. The guests waited, their curiosity piqued. Margaret, George, and the rest of the family stood at attention, unsure of what to make of the situation. Peter carefully peeled back the wrapping, revealing a simple wooden box. There was no gold, no diamonds, no grand gesture, but as he opened it, his heart stopped. Inside, nestled within the fabric lining, was a ring. It wasn't a diamond ring, nor was it encrusted with jewels. It was a ring made of carved wood, intricately etched with beautiful patterns. It was not just a ring, it was a symbol of Thomas's unwavering love, of his hard work, and of his devotion to his son. The room fell silent as the guests took in the significance of the gift. They had expected something grand, something material, but what they received instead was far more valuable. A gift that money could not buy. And in that moment, Peter realized that sometimes, the most powerful things are the simplest. The unexpected gift. The room was frozen in a profound silence, the hum of distant conversations from the guests now completely drowned out. All eyes were fixed on Peter as he slowly lifted the wooden box from its wrapping. There was no elaborate speech, no grand flourish, just the quiet, deliberate motion of a father's love materialized in the simplest form. Peter's hands shook ever so slightly as he held the box, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel the gaze of every guest, every member of Emily's family, all of them waiting, some with a mixture of confusion and skepticism, others perhaps with curiosity, to see what would unfold next. As he opened the box, he revealed the ring, its delicate patterns etched into the wood, smooth to the touch, a work of art that had been shaped by years of craftsmanship and love. There was something undeniably powerful in the simplicity of the gift. It wasn't adorned with diamonds or glittering precious stones. It didn't come in a velvet-lined case with gold trimmings. It was just a ring. But it was so much more than that. The more Peter looked at it, the more he saw the countless hours his father had spent carving it by hand. He could imagine Thomas, sitting in the small, dimly lit room in their modest home, his rough hands carefully chiseling the wood, giving it form and life, just as he had shaped Peter's character over the years. It was a reflection of who Thomas was, a man whose worth could not be measured in money, but in the quiet strength, resilience, and love he had shown every single day. Peter felt a lump form in his throat, his heart swelling with emotion. He turned to Emily, her eyes wide with surprise, and then to his father, who stood behind him, his face a mixture of pride and humility. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about trying to win over George and Margaret, or anyone else in the room. It was simply about love, the kind of love that had sustained them through hardships, the kind of love that had kept them going through sleepless nights, through struggles, through every obstacle that life had thrown their way. But the silence that had enveloped the room wasn't just a reflection of awe at the ring itself. It was a deeper, more unsettling silence. George, Margaret, and the other guests exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, as if they were trying to comprehend what had just happened. What had just been presented to them wasn't just an object, it was a challenge. A challenge to everything they had believed in, everything they had prided themselves on. It was a reminder that wealth, status, and material possessions weren't the only markers of value in this world. For the first time, the truth seemed to sink in. The wealth that George and Margaret had so carefully cultivated throughout their lives meant very little in comparison to what Thomas had just given them. The ring, though simple, was a testament to the values of hard work, sacrifice, and authenticity. It was a symbol of a life well lived, a life built not on the foundation of privilege, but on resilience and love. Margaret, for the first time that evening, looked slightly disoriented. Her lips parted as though to say something, but no words came out. George's face was a mixture of confusion and reluctant admiration. He was still trying to make sense of the moment, of how a humble janitor, someone he had dismissed as unworthy of his daughter's love, could have created something so meaningful. Something so powerful. Peter held the ring up, letting the light from the chandelier catch the smooth surface of the wood. The intricate designs seemed to dance in the reflection, as if they had come to life. It was in that moment, with the weight of everyone's gaze fixed upon him, that Peter realized this was the true test, the moment when he would not only stand up for himself, but for his father, for everything they had fought for the life they had created together. "Dad," Peter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. This is beautiful." Thomas gave a small, humble smile, his eyes twinkling with a quiet pride. "It's not much," he said softly, as though still unsure of the impact his simple gift had made. "But it's all I've got to offer." Emily stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch Peter's arm. Her gaze shifted from the wooden ring to her parents and back again. There was a vulnerability in her expression, a raw honesty that had been carefully concealed beneath the surface until now. It was clear that she, too, was processing the weight of the moment, the weight of her parents' reaction, and the realization that her family was being forced to confront their own biases. "Mom, Dad," Emily began, her voice steady but filled with an underlying current of emotion. "This ring, it's not just a gift. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of Peter's story. A part of my story. It represents everything my father has done for me, everything he's sacrificed. And it represents what Peter's father has done for him." Margaret's lips tightened as if she were holding back something, perhaps an apology, or perhaps a more biting comment. George, on the other hand, had gone completely silent, his brow furrowed in deep thought. Peter could almost see the gears turning in his mind as he struggled to reconcile the man who stood before him, offering such a humble gift, with the preconceived notions he had clung to for so long. Thomas, however, remained unfazed. His gaze was steady, his expression calm, as though he had anticipated this moment. This was not the first time he had been the subject of judgment, and it wouldn't be the last. But what mattered was the quiet dignity with which he faced it. "It's about family," Thomas said, his voice low but filled with strength. "And it's about love. That's what I've tried to teach my son. I don't have riches to pass on, but I have love, and I have integrity. And that's worth more than anything you could buy." The words hung in the air, clear and unwavering. It was a challenge, but it was also a reminder. A reminder that love and character were the true measures of a man, not the superficial trappings of wealth or status. And, for the first time that evening, the guests seemed to pause and reconsider what they had long assumed. There was a long, uncomfortable silence as the guests looked at one another, unsure of how to respond. Some fidgeted in their seats, others exchanged glances, but none of them spoke for what seemed like an eternity. Margaret, her face flushed, shifted her weight uncomfortably, but George seemed lost in thought, his gaze no longer fixed on Thomas but on the ring in Peter's hand, as if he were seeing it in a new light. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat, the sound breaking the tension that had thickened in the air. She was the first to speak, though her words were not as crisp and controlled as they had been earlier. I hadn't expected this," she admitted quietly. Her voice was strained, as though the sincerity of Thomas's gesture had caught her off guard. "I didn't realize how much you meant to Emily." To Peter. The room fell silent once more. It was an apology, of sorts, though not one that had been fully spoken. Margaret had always prided herself on being in control, but in that moment, she had been forced to confront the discomfort of her own assumptions. It was clear that she had underestimated Thomas, and by extension, Peter, and now, for the first time, she was forced to reckon with the fact that her views had been wrong. George's voice broke through the silence next, more measured, more thoughtful. "Perhaps I've been wrong," he said, his tone softer than before. "Perhaps I've been too quick to judge. I'll admit that." It wasn't a grand apology, nor was it one that fully erased the years of judgment they had imposed on Peter and his father. But it was a beginning. A crack in the wall that had once divided them, an acknowledgement that perhaps there was more to Peter, and to Thomas, than they had ever given credit for. Peter's heart swelled as he looked from his father to Emily, her eyes filled with quiet pride in something else, something deeper, something more meaningful. This wasn't just about the ring. It was about a shift, a turning point. For the first time, her parents were beginning to see what Peter had always known, that Thomas was not just a janitor, not just a man defined by his profession. He was a father, a provider, and a man of immense integrity. And as the evening unfolded, the tension in the room seemed to dissolve. The walls that had once separated them, the walls of judgment, of prejudice, began to crumble, replaced by a new understanding, a new respect. It was a slow process, but it was happening. For Peter and Emily, it was the beginning of something new. A new chapter, not just in their lives together, but in their relationships with the people they loved. And as the night drew to a close, Peter looked at his father once more, the man who had never sought approval but had earned respect in the most profound way possible. He knew that this was the gift that would last far longer than anything material, a gift of love, humility, and unwavering strength. And it was one that could never be taken away. A gift of love and sacrifice. The moments following the exchange felt like a strange blend of relief and disbelief, as if the world had shifted imperceptibly, but irrevocably, in a direction no one had expected. The silence that had initially hung in the room began to give way to a murmur, the guests slowly starting to process what had transpired. Peter, still holding the wooden ring in his hands, glanced around the room. Margaret and George seemed to be engaged in quiet conversation with each other, their expressions unreadable. Some of the guests, who had previously been merely curious observers, were now deep in conversation, some offering words of praise for Thomas's craftsmanship, others uncertain about how to navigate the unexpected turn of events. Peter turned to Emily, whose eyes were wide but filled with something more, a mixture of pride, gratitude, and perhaps a touch of disbelief herself. The strain that had been evident in her features earlier seemed to have eased slightly, though there was still a tension in her posture. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had hoped for when she convinced her parents to give Peter and his family a chance. But now, as the reality of the moment set in, she too had to come to terms with the fact that her parents would never see things the same way again. They couldn't unsee the humble truth of her father's gesture. "You okay?" Peter asked softly, his voice tender but laced with concern. Emily nodded slowly, though her eyes were clouded with a mixture of emotions. She had spent so long fighting for her family to understand Peter, for them to see beyond the surface, and now, it felt as though the battle had come to a standstill. "I don't know what's happening," she admitted. "This was never supposed to be this complicated." Peter took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "It's not about the ring, Em. It never was. This is about something bigger. About showing them who we are, who my dad is, and that we don't have to be anything other than ourselves." Emily's expression softened, but there was still a trace of unease in her eyes. "I just never expected them to think about it differently," Peter finished for her. He glanced over at Thomas, who was now seated off to the side, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions swirling around him. He had expected nothing from this gathering except to support his son, and perhaps this very simplicity was what made his presence so profound. Thomas had quietly returned to his seat, his hands folded in his lap, as if he hadn't just revealed a small yet monumental act of love to the very people who had, for so long, considered him inferior. He wasn't concerned about what anyone thought of him, he never had been. It was never about impressing anyone. It was about doing what he could to help Peter build the life he deserved. Peter watched his father carefully, taking in his stoic but unwavering posture. "Dad never expected anything in return," Peter continued, his voice full of admiration. "But he showed them who he is, and that's what matters." Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. She simply nodded, as though the weight of what Peter was saying had finally begun to sink in. This wasn't about grand gestures or material gifts. This was about the slow, steady accumulation of respect, built over a lifetime of sacrifice and unwavering love. Thomas had given them more than just a simple wooden ring, he had shown them his heart, his values, his character. It was all he had to offer, and that was enough. As the dinner resumed, the tension that had once defined the room began to soften, though it still hung in the air like the aftershock of a storm. The conversation had shifted from the gift to more neutral topics, the weather, the upcoming wedding plans, and vague comments about the future. But for Peter and Emily, it was clear that something had changed. It was subtle at first, the way George and Margaret's demeanor had shifted. There was a noticeable coolness that had been replaced with something else, perhaps recognition or a begrudging acknowledgement. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was a start. Peter could hear George speaking with Thomas across the room, their voices low but engaged in conversation. For the first time, there seemed to be a genuine attempt on George's part to engage with Thomas as more than just Emily's future father-in-law. It was still awkward, still tentative, but it was the first sign that the walls between them might be coming down. As the evening wore on, Emily and Peter found themselves surrounded by more questions, but this time, they were different. They were no longer interrogations masked as polite conversation. The guests were genuinely curious, asking about Thomas's life, his work, and his experiences. There was a respect in their tone now that hadn't been there before, an acknowledgement that Thomas's quiet presence carried a wisdom that couldn't be ignored. The night ended with laughter, music, and the quiet hum of guests leaving for their homes, some exchanging kind words and promises to return for the wedding. But for Peter and Emily, the real change had already happened. As they stood together near the door, watching the last of the guests leave, Peter felt a profound sense of relief. Emily turned to him, a small but sincere smile on her face. "You were right," she said softly. "It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was just about us. About showing them who we really are." Peter smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been all day. "Exactly. We can't change who we are to fit into someone else's mold. We can't control how people see us. But we can control what we give, and that's what matters." The words hung between them, a quiet declaration of the bond they shared, and of the life they were building together. It had been a long and difficult road to get to this point, but it was one that had been worth every step. The future, though uncertain, seemed just a little bit clearer now. The battle for acceptance, though not over, had taken a significant turn. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted them, the sounds of the night filling the space around them. They stood there for a few moments, simply enjoying the peace that had finally settled over them. Peter felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. This day had been filled with so many unknowns, so many fears about how their love would be received. But it had ended with something even more powerful, a sense of clarity. Emily's family was not perfect, and neither was he. But together, they had faced something bigger than themselves, the realization that love could transcend their differences, that love could heal the wounds of the past. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and they turned to see Thomas approaching, a quiet smile on his face. "Well, that went better than I expected," he said with a chuckle, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Peter laughed, feeling a warmth spread through him at the sight of his father's calm demeanor. "You think," he teased. "I thought for a moment they might throw us out of the house." Thomas shook his head, his smile widening. "Not likely. But I have to admit, I wasn't sure what would happen either. But we're still standing." Peter nodded, his heart full of gratitude. "I'm glad you were here, Dad. You don't know how much it means to me." Thomas placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and pride. "It's all I've ever wanted, son. For you to stand tall, to know your worth, and to never let anyone make you feel small. You've done that today. You've done that every day." Peter looked at his father, his chest swelling with pride. This wasn't just about the gift Thomas had given him. It was about everything he had taught him over the years, about standing firm in the face of adversity, about never compromising on the things that truly matter. And as they stood there, together, Emily by his side and his father by his, Peter knew one thing for certain: this was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A chapter where love, respect, and humility would be their guiding principles, no matter what the future held. The journey had only just begun, but with his father's strength and Emily's unwavering support, Peter felt ready to face whatever came their way. They had proven, together, that no matter the challenges, their love was worth more than any material gift, and that was something no one could ever take away. A new beginning. The days following the wedding rehearsal were filled with a sense of quiet victory for Peter and Emily. Though the echoes of the dinner party's tense moments still lingered in their minds, the air around them had shifted. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was far from smooth, but something had undeniably changed. George and Margaret, despite their initial reservations, had made efforts to reach out to Peter in the days following the gathering, a tentative but sincere attempt to bridge the gap between them. Emily noticed it first. Her parents, who had once been so rigid in their expectations, now seemed to be making room for Peter in their world. It wasn't easy for them, not by any stretch of the imagination, but each small gesture, each more meaningful conversation, spoke volumes about their willingness to change. George had even offered to help Peter with a work-related project, something as mundane as a business deal involving one of the companies he owned. It was the first time Emily had seen her father treat Peter with anything resembling true regard, not as a future son-in-law, but as an equal. Peter, for his part, had remained gracious, accepting the overtures without an ounce of resentment. He could feel that things were different, but he didn't want to push too hard. He had never expected them to instantly embrace him as one of their own. He didn't need their approval to feel validated. He had earned his place in the world long before meeting Emily. But still, the small gestures, the way George now listened more closely when Peter spoke, and the way Margaret's smile seemed a little warmer, made him feel as though something had shifted, maybe not their views entirely, but their willingness to give him a chance. As much as Peter had hoped for this change, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of quiet discomfort when George and Margaret would retreat into old habits, when the underlying assumptions would creep in, masked by politeness. Peter knew that their ingrained biases wouldn't disappear overnight. But the difference now was that they were trying. They were making an effort, however imperfect. And that effort was something Emily deeply appreciated. The real test came just a week after the wedding rehearsal, on a crisp Sunday morning when the two families gathered together for brunch at a charming local cafe. It was a neutral space, a place where they could meet halfway, away from the grandeur of the estate and the weight of their past misunderstandings. Emily and Peter arrived early, and as they stood at the entrance, Peter couldn't help but notice how much more relaxed he felt compared to that first dinner. It wasn't that he wasn't still apprehensive, but somehow the stakes felt lower. Maybe because they had already survived the hardest test, and somehow, they were still standing. As George and Margaret entered the cafe, Peter saw the subtle shift in their demeanor. It wasn't just about being polite anymore, there was a genuine warmth in their greetings, a sense of familiarity that hadn't been there before. George even reached out to shake Peter's hand, and for the first time, the handshake wasn't just a gesture, it was an acknowledgement of Peter as part of their family, as someone who had earned his place there. The small talk that followed was light, about the weather, about the renovations they had planned for the estate, about upcoming family gatherings, but beneath the surface, the atmosphere had changed. There was no longer an undercurrent of judgment, of unseen walls between them. Emily glanced at Peter, a quiet smile playing on her lips. She had been waiting for this, for the moment when their worlds would begin to blend into one. And here it was, slowly but surely, coming together. But even in this moment of peace, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that there were things unsaid. Margaret, though smiling, had a look of quiet reservation in her eyes, still, he could tell, processing everything. Though she had come a long way from the critical matriarch who had doubted their love, there was still a part of her that hesitated. She was cautious, perhaps even afraid that the cracks in her worldview were widening too fast, too uncomfortably. And it wasn't just because of him. It was because of the realization that everything she had built her life on, the status, the wealth, the expectations of success, was not the foundation of love, of family, or of true happiness. For Emily, this was a turning point. She had always known her parents weren't perfect, that their values were narrow, but she had always hoped they would come to see the bigger picture. And now, she could see them beginning to understand. It wasn't just about Peter anymore, it was about the idea of family, of acceptance, of what it truly meant to love unconditionally. It was about dismantling old ideas and making space for new ones. She had always hoped they would get there, but now, standing in that cafe, she saw that it was no longer a question of if but when. They were learning, bit by bit, that the world wasn't as small as they had once thought, and neither were the people in it. As the meal progressed, the conversation shifted to more personal matters. Margaret finally spoke up, her voice calm and thoughtful. "Peter," she began, her gaze meeting his, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about your family. I didn't understand it before, why you and Emily were so determined to be together. But now, I see that it's not about what we have or don't have. It's about who we are, who we choose to be. And I want you to know that. I'm sorry for the way I treated you." The apology was understated, simple, but it carried a weight far more significant than anything Margaret had said before. Emily's eyes welled with tears as she reached across the table to take Peter's hand. This was the moment she had been hoping for. The moment when her parents finally saw the depth of her love for Peter, the sincerity in his heart. The moment when they finally acknowledged that love wasn't measured by material things, by status, or by appearances. It was something deeper, something that could weather the storm of judgment and prejudice, something that could build bridges even between the most unlikely of people. Peter, overwhelmed by the honesty in Margaret's voice, felt the tension in his chest loosen. This was a turning point, and for the first time, he could feel the weight of the past slipping away. He didn't know if everything would be perfect from here on out. He didn't know if Margaret and George would ever fully embrace him as one of their own. But he knew, with unwavering certainty, that this was progress. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where acceptance, understanding, and love would shape their future. Emily's hand tightened around his as they shared a quiet glance. This moment, this tiny breakthrough, was everything they had dreamed of, a chance to begin anew, a chance to build a future that was shaped not by their differences, but by their shared love and commitment to one another. As the meal came to an end and the families parted ways, Peter felt lighter, freer, than he had in a long time. He looked at Emily, her face glowing with quiet joy, and he knew that they had made it through. They had survived the hard conversations, the judgments, the misunderstandings, and they had come out the other side stronger for it. The path ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but as long as they had each other, and as long as they had the support of those willing to change, they knew that love would always lead the way. The weeks following that Sunday brunch were filled with small, everyday moments of connection. George and Margaret invited Peter to family dinners, though they remained subtle in their attempts to include him. They didn't try to overwhelm him, but they also didn't shy away from letting him be a part of their lives. Thomas, too, was invited to join in some of these family gatherings, though he remained humble and gracious, never forcing himself into the fold, but instead letting his presence speak for itself. It was a slow dance, a gradual evolution, but Peter had never been one to rush things. He had learned long ago that the most enduring relationships weren't built overnight. They were forged through patience, understanding, and mutual respect. And as he looked around at the small moments of progress that were beginning to unfold, he knew that he and Emily were on the right path. Their love had already overcome so much, and now, as they worked together to build bridges with her family, it felt as though they were truly creating something new, a legacy of love, one that would stand the test of time. A legacy that, in its simplest form, was built not on what they had or didn't have, but on what they gave. For Peter, that was the true gift, the ability to look beyond the surface, to see the hearts of those around him, and to know, beyond all doubt, that he was worthy of that love. It was the lesson his father had taught him, that no matter the obstacles, no matter the judgments, love was always the answer. And as he and Emily walked into their future together, they carried that lesson with them, knowing that it was the strongest foundation of all. A legacy of love. Years passed, and the seasons of life continued their relentless march forward, as they always did. For Peter and Emily, each year that came and went seemed to solidify the foundation they had carefully built together, a foundation that had been tested, shaken, and reformed, but never broken. The challenges they had faced in the early days of their relationship now seemed distant, as though they were relics of another time. The harsh whispers, the subtle judgments, the uncertainty, all of it had melted away, replaced by something stronger, something more resilient, a family forged in love, respect, and the quiet power of unity. Peter and Emily had grown, both individually and together. They had learned to navigate the intricacies of family dynamics, the delicate dance of balancing their love with the realities of what it meant to belong to two worlds that had once seemed so far apart. And through it all, they had never wavered in their commitment to one another. Through every trial, every success, every quiet moment shared in their home, their love had remained the bedrock upon which everything else was built. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the golden leaves fell from the trees outside, Peter stood in the backyard of their home, watching his children play. The sound of their laughter was a beautiful reminder of how far they had come, of the family they had created despite the odds. He smiled to himself as he watched his son, a mirror of his younger self, chase after his daughter, both of them running with wild abandon, their giggles rising to the sky. Peter's thoughts turned to Thomas, who had passed on a few years earlier. The grief that followed his father's death had been deep and raw, a sorrow that had settled into Peter's chest like an anchor. But time, as it always did, had allowed the sharp edges of that grief to soften. The memories of his father's quiet strength, his unwavering support, had become a part of Peter's own story, woven into the fabric of the life he was building with Emily. Thomas had never been one to boast about his accomplishments, but his legacy was etched into the very core of Peter's being. The ring that had once stunned Emily's parents, the simple wooden ring that had so powerfully demonstrated the value of love over wealth, had become a cherished heirloom. Peter had kept it close for years, its worn surface a symbol of everything his father had given him. It was now a piece of family history, a reminder to his children of the man who had shaped their father into the man he was today. As Peter watched his children, he couldn't help but reflect on how far his own journey had come. He had spent so many years fighting for a place in this world, for the recognition that his love for Emily was just as valid as anyone else's, that his background, his father's profession, didn't define his worth. And now, as he looked at the life he had built, he saw a future that was richer and fuller than he had ever imagined. Not because of wealth or status, but because of the love that had always been there, patiently waiting to unfold. Emily came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist as she rested her head on his shoulder. He could feel the warmth of her embrace, the steady heartbeat that had always been his anchor. Together, they had weathered the storms, and together, they had created something that would last far beyond their lifetimes. "This is what it's all about, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice filled with quiet joy. Peter nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Yeah, it is. Family. Love. It's everything." They stood there in silence for a moment, taking in the sight of their children, their future. Peter knew that everything they had worked for, everything they had fought for, had been worth it. The love they shared was the legacy they would pass on to their children, and it was the legacy that would continue to ripple outward for generations to come. As the evening drew near, they gathered inside, the warmth of the home enveloping them like a comforting embrace. Dinner was a quiet affair, filled with laughter and conversation, the normalcy of their everyday life settling over them like a well-worn blanket. It was in these small moments, these simple acts of togetherness, that Peter realized the true depth of what he had achieved. And yet, even in the quiet moments, there was still so much more to come. Peter knew that his journey was far from over. The world around him, though filled with love and family, still held challenges. The prejudices and biases that had once threatened to tear his relationship with Emily apart still existed, lurking beneath the surface. But Peter had come to understand that love, when built on a foundation of respect and understanding, could withstand even the most insidious of forces. In time, the lessons of his father, of quiet dignity, of perseverance, of humility, had become ingrained in him. He was no longer the young man who had once stood in front of that mirror, wondering if he could ever belong. He was a father now, a husband, a man who had seen the power of love and sacrifice. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Their children, too, would grow up in a world where love was their first and most important lesson. Peter would teach them about the sacrifices that had been made, about the strength of character that had been passed down from generation to generation. He would teach them about the value of humility, of never judging others by the surface, and of always looking beyond what others saw. But most of all, he would teach them that no matter what the world said, their worth was not determined by their background, their wealth, or their status. It was determined by their hearts. As they sat down together at the dinner table that evening, with their children around them, the world felt right. They had created a life that was meaningful, that was built on love and understanding, and they had done it together. It had been a long and difficult road to get here, but Peter knew that they were stronger for it. And as the years continued to pass, he would carry with him the legacy of his father, the quiet man who had shaped him, and who had taught him that love was the greatest gift of all. Years later, when Peter's children were grown, and the time came for them to step into the world on their own, they too would carry the lessons their father had taught them. They would understand that the true measure of a person was not their wealth, their job, or their appearance, but the love and integrity with which they lived their lives. They would understand that no matter the challenges they faced, they had the power to overcome them, just as Peter had. And one day, when Peter was long gone, when his children had children of their own, the legacy of love and sacrifice that Thomas had given him would live on, passed down through the generations. The simple wooden ring would be a reminder not of material wealth, but of what truly mattered, the strength of family, the value of hard work, and the unshakable power of love. The story of Peter and Emily, of their families, of their struggles and triumphs, would continue to inspire those who heard it, just as their love would continue to inspire those who came after them. And in that way, their legacy would never fade, it would live on forever, in the hearts of those who remembered the lessons of love that they had shared. And so, the story would continue, woven into the fabric of their family, passed from one generation to the next. A legacy of love.